Community has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.
May the peace and blessings of Almighty God be upon you. Welcome to this, the 25th episode of Press Point. Today we're looking at the migration crisis, particularly that which is hit very strongly within the Mediterranean region of Europe. The issues that we want to look at are particularly framed in the context of a huge number of migrants or refugees who have lost their lives this year, approximately 1,700, maybe many more than that. We want to look at the human tragedy of the situation and to understand the human experience of what's happened. But we also want to analyse the causes and some of the push and the pull factors. Why are migrants and refugees leaving these places and why are they drawn towards Europe? But also to understand the solutions. What can we do about it and how can we look to alleviate the suffering and also create a much safer and more secure environment within which migration can take place, and even the very question of migration itself will be discussed today on this program. So welcome to the show, and I'm very pleased to have with me in the studio my Mr. Kaleem Sadiq.
And a very warm welcome to our viewers. Do remember that this is a live program and we want you to interact with us through email, first of all, on presspoint@mta.tv. We also have the facility of tweeting and Facebook as well, and that is through @presspointmta. We'll carry on with the discussion regarding migration and the tragedy that's occurring, particularly on the Mediterranean Sea.
And Kaleem, we're very lucky to have with us in the studio two special guests. So we have on my immediate left, Dr. Iftikhar Yaz, as well as holding, most welcome to the show, Mr. Yaz, as well as holding a number of posts over several years within the UN. Mr. Yaz is now working as a diplomat with the Tuvalu Islands. But the particular role which you bring today is your background within human rights as a human rights emissary for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community.
Correct, yes.
So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We're also very lucky to have with us Professor Kaleem Tahinoff. Professor Tahinoff is coming from a number of different backgrounds with a number of different expertise, particularly in culture and in literature. And particularly at the moment, Professor Tahinoff holds the George Steiner Chair of Comparative Literature at Queen Mary University of London. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And Kaleem, we also have with us a security expert, Ibad Ibrahim, who will be giving us a particular analysis of the African context. He's based in Ghana, but he'll be looking at it from the Pan-African context as well. So we'll bring him on shortly.
And in addition to that, we've also had the opportunity to speak with several other guests at the same time.
Yes, so we've got a number of interviews, so quite a packed show for us today. So let's start off with an overview. We've mentioned already, Kaleem, what the context or the wider issue which we want to talk about is the migrant crisis. In other ways, it could be called the refugee crisis because many of these people are fleeing wars, they're fleeing persecution. As we mentioned, within this year alone, approximately 1,700 people have died making the crossing between the African continent to Europe. Many of them going to Italy, many of them going to Greece, some of them coming in through Turkey, but a large number coming particularly from Libya and making a crossing in very perilous seas, in very rickety boats, and many of them as a result losing their lives. And I know, Kaleem, you've done quite a bit of research on this topic and you've been looking online. What articles have you found which give a good overview of the situation?
Well, the situation is quite harrowing and nothing can tell a better story on the situation than a photograph or a picture. And if we go to The Economist, first of all, that actually shows quite a harrowing picture of a boat which crosses over the Mediterranean. And this is no safe boat. We can see that there's rust on the sides and there's plenty of people at every level of the deck. And I'm sure that they must have had a harrowing experience trying to cross over the Mediterranean. This article goes into some depth in terms of where the people are coming from, but to give a graphic example of this, we can see this from this next image, which is from CFR.org, which shows that people are making their way into Europe through different means. First of all, you have the route via Turkey, which is along land, and that seems to be the pathway that people take from most of the northern Middle East, from Iran, etc. But the stories of tragedy which are occurring across the Mediterranean are mainly related to exits from Libya. But the suction from Libya into the across the Mediterranean seems to be pulling from the whole of Africa, particularly the Horn of Africa and sub-Saharan Africa as well. So these people are coming for various reasons, and we'll go into that soon. But we can see graphically what's actually happening there. In terms of the tragedy itself, we have this bar graph which shows that with respect to the rest of the world, we can see that deaths occurring across the Mediterranean are far higher than that seen in other coastal areas. And you wouldn't consider the Bay of Bengal to be an area where there would be great health and safety in place. With regards to the number of deaths, you'd expect there to be quite a high number of deaths because the shipping, the ships and the types of vessels that you have there may not be very good, but the level of deaths seen in the Mediterranean far higher. We see in 2015 alone 1,727 deaths, and last year around 3,279. And I must add that this is the recorded figure that we see only across the Mediterranean. The numbers of people who may have died en route to the Mediterranean coast may be much higher.
Yes. Let's start off then with a video which gives us an overview of the context and of the experience of this migrant journey, or of this path of refuge which many people are taking. Let's go to that video now.
In the last few months, more than 1,700 migrants are known to have died at sea, whilst escaping war and poverty in their homeland, to come to what they believed would be a new and better life in the West. Just last month, as many as 700 people died in a single incident in the Mediterranean when a ship carrying migrants from Libya sank en route to Italy. Whilst migrants have been travelling by sea from Africa and the Middle East to Europe for some time, what is alarming is the sheer scale of people risking their lives to make this journey. Civil war and violence in many countries around the world, such as Syria and Libya, are being held accountable as the root cause for the dramatic increase in migrants. Tragically, recent events which occurred haven't acted as a deterrent for others, as evidenced by the effort of those continuing to attempt this perilous journey. As a result of this, there's been intense discussion and emergency talks held amongst European leaders in the past few weeks to discuss how to tackle this issue and how to prevent further tragedies from occurring. Whilst there is an agreement on the need for action to be taken, there are very differing views amongst politicians over the root cause of the issue, as well as what should be done to prevent this from continuing.
With more questions, and we'll have a good flow. Going to just do a shot.
Prior to this event. However, this action did little to prevent the continuous wave of migrants. Some firmly believe that those running these operations should be targeted, in the hope that tackling the root cause of this will stop future cases. Others are more concerned with the well-being of migrants and ensuring that they are given a chance at a better life than the one they are fleeing from. This in itself is a point of debate, as there is a fear that inviting migrants into Europe will only act to inspire others to do the same. While talks are continuing, it is clear that action needs to be taken soon, as there is no end to the number of people wanting to make the journey, despite its risks, to flee from the chaos they are experiencing at home.
So, Professor Tihanov, when we're looking at this global crisis, and many people are calling it a global crisis, How would you best explain, in almost layman's terms, what is going on here? What is this crisis that we're talking about?
It is a crisis of displacement, which has this very tragic sense of people being forced out of their homes for various reasons, political and religious. And when we say a global crisis, we have to bear in mind that it is global to the extent to which it now forces Europe to rethink its position in the world. Because Europe for many decades was hoping that it would project soft power onto the rest of the world, and an example of doing so would work, and somehow its values would be spread peacefully across the globe. And now it's forced to rethink that, and it's forced to face this question: are we going to turn into a fortress Europe, which would minimize the chance of influencing the rest of the world, or are we going to continue to uphold these universal values of helping preserve human dignity, extending help to those who need it most? To that extent, this is a global crisis because it involves the redefinition of what Europe thinks of itself and how Europe sees itself. It's also global because it goes right into the heart of what is happening in the Middle East and also in Africa, and we might return to this point later on. But one important thing here is not to forget that even a global crisis has a human dimension. Yes. And there are individual human lives at stake, which no amount of political debate can soften and can alleviate these personal tragedies.
So it's essential, really, to be keeping in focus the human understanding. Dr. Yaz, I mean, we've heard from Professor Tihanov that it's in many ways a crisis. Why is this such a problem for European leaders and nations here in Europe? Why is this posing such a challenge for them?
Well, human displacement over the past some years, particularly over the past 5 years, has grown into a monstrous disaster. It's not only limited to the Mediterranean, it's all over the world. It goes as far as Ukraine. You are now having migrants coming over from Eastern Europe and Ukraine flooding into Europe. And actually, the incidents in the Mediterranean were a wake-up call for Europe and European Union. As we know, there has not been a uniform policy to absorb and accept migrants in Europe. Some countries have been doing on their own accord because of their bilateral relations or involvement in the crisis, which are the root cause of this displacement and migration. The UNHCR, which is the main global and international body to take care of the refugees and the displaced people, was not prepared to face such a crisis. And they have not been able to make any contribution to save the lives which are being lost almost every day.
Dr. Yaz, you mentioned the Mediterranean in particular, and I wanted Professor Tihanov, what is, just to really spell it out, what has happened in the Mediterranean recently in relation to migration which is so shocking?
What is really shocking, I think, was the fact that the European Union was frankly slow in reacting to this, precisely because of the lack of a common immigration policy, but also perhaps because it was startled by this chain of events which, while it could have predicted, the extent of these events was in a sense overwhelming. And I think it was also part of this old fortress mentality that was inhibiting the European Union in moving very swiftly. And when it did move, it is now thinking something that is very new in terms of EU practice, which is introducing quotas, spreading these migrants and these refugees in roughly proportionate numbers across the EU. And this is what will be the subject of a meeting on this coming Wednesday. The problem, of course, is that a number of countries in the EU, the UK, Ireland, Denmark, have various opt-outs when it comes to the implementation of asylum and migration policies. And I think you're absolutely right in drawing attention to the Eastern European wave of migration. But the EU at the time thought that this is still essentially economic migration from within countries that had recently gained accession to the EU. Now, what is happening right now in Libya and in Italy and Malta and Greece, this is a qualitatively different moment, because this is a crisis that the EU faces outward, not within the EU, but that is forcing it really to think how it relates to Africa and to the Middle East.
So on this point, Professor Tianov, actually, I think this is a really key point, which is how do we understand the people that are coming into Europe, and how do we understand this migration question? And I think, Brother Kaleem, you have a very interesting article from the Sun newspaper, which helps to show the different narratives which people are engaged in about migration, and hopefully this can chime with Professor Tianov's point.
Yeah, interesting to say the least. This is an article that you can see in your screens now. Rescue boats, I'd use gunships to stop migrants. And this is an article by Katie Hopkins, who's a Sun columnist. And she's described the migrants themselves as cockroaches. And quite horrific in itself. Maybe it's a publicity stunt on her own side, but the extent to which she actually dehumanizes the whole situation is quite horrific. And she's actually talked about wanting to see gunships at the borders of Europe to stop people coming into Europe. This article itself has actually horrified so many people that the UNHCR itself has actually condemned it. And it isn't the first time that she's actually come up with something like this. She's also criticized dementia patients blocking beds in NHS hospitals. She's also talked about other ethnic communities within the UK in a derogatory manner. So we can put that into perspective that this is a one-off viewpoint, and I'm sure that this isn't a viewpoint that is held by most Europeans. But the fact that she was able to voice that tells us that there is a level of concern within Europe about the rate of migration, and the fact that people are not happy that these people are coming across, and perhaps there is also a side agenda to actually take away the human picture of the situation.
Well, I mean, I think that's very true in many ways, Kaleem, because if you look at this article in question, I think it has a picture. I don't know if we can get it on the screen again. It has a picture of a number of men jumping over a motorway in Calais, and she draws the connection and says that if you have these boats coming across from the Mediterranean, then that in effect means that you'll have more migrants in the UK, and you'll have more people claiming benefits, welfare benefits. And therefore she says, I have no sympathy, even if they drown, I don't mind, because in reality this is about more migrants on UK soil. And I think that's a conversation which is taking place all the way across Europe at the moment. What do you think, Dr. Yaz? I mean, you know, in reality, is she right to say that these migrants are in effect cockroaches? It's a very strong phrase, and I put it in a slightly provocative, but what's your take on that?
I think the most important point to appreciate, and not only appreciate, but thoroughly consider, is that migrants are human beings. and all human beings have the right to dignity. They have a right to safe and secure lifespan, and they have other rights as well, which we can discuss, but we do not go off the point. But the important thing is that it is not significant, or it is not proper to address human beings in a term or with a phrase or with a word which is derogatory. Human beings are human beings. And if we really look at the crisis, humanity has a responsibility towards creating this crisis. We must look at the root causes where these displaced people come from. And we must also appreciate that this crisis has been exploited by the traffickers, by the smugglers, and quite a proportion of these migrants are irregular migrants. They are people who are not actually displaced, but they join a group of those who have been genuinely displaced and need the attention of the international bodies to have a secure and safe place to follow their and continue their lives. So there are all those matters. And actually, when a conflict arises, like the conflict, say, in Syria or Libya or elsewhere, it is the responsibility of the United Nations organs to also appreciate and be prepared to handle the fallouts of such a crisis. I mean, nobody would say that proper management could ignore the question of displaced people that was going to happen anyway after the crisis of IS or other conflicts, you know, in Iraq and Libya and Syria, etc. This was expected.
It's their role really to step forwards. I think as well, what Dr. Yaz is mentioning here is very relevant to an interview which I believe, Kaleem, you undertook earlier this week, which is, well, we have a few interviews, but I think let's start with Jean Lambert MEP, which I think again resonates with a number of Dr. Yaz's points. And she was talking, I think, particularly about how do we respond to a crisis and how does Europe respond to a crisis. As an MEP, a European parliamentarian, she's looking at it from that angle. So let's see what she has to say.
The crisis has become a major issue for EU leaders. Do you think this issue has been ignored for too long?
No, I don't think it's been ignored. I think people, leaders have been well aware of quite a number of the issues, and indeed, at the European Union end, there's quite a range of legislation which applies to asylum, which applies to immigration. The UK is in some of that, but out of quite a lot of that legislation. So that's there. But in terms of, some of the most recent tragedies that we're seeing, I think the awareness has been there. The willingness to act is the thing that's been missing.
Now, the EU wants to do something about this, and the EU has recently launched a 10-point action plan on migration. Do you think these action plans are actually effective?
I think at least with the action plans, they give a sense of direction. The question then becomes, okay, what do national governments make of these proposals? And indeed, the European Parliament will be involved with some of them. I mean, there are certain of the proposals there, for example, the action that will be taken against smugglers and traffickers, which I think a number of us have problems with, this whole business of destruction of boats by which people are currently sort of crossing the Mediterranean. We have concerns about that on a whole range of issues. But in terms of the support that's offered to those member states that do come under particular pressure at times, this is an area where we have been saying for years that member states really, really need to cooperate, to assist each other, to really show solidarity. And this time it looks as if at least there may be some forward movement on that, which is very much to be welcomed because, as I say, the history on this has been very little action and lots of words, but little action.
What could the EU do at a grassroots level or at a national level within the home countries of these people to help remove or alleviate some of the crises that they are facing? For instance, many of the migrants that are coming from war-torn areas of the world.
I think it's very, very difficult if we're looking, for example, at Syria, which at the moment is where we're seeing the largest number of people coming from, certainly in terms of border crossing, the largest number of people having refugee or protection status. I think that, well, there's a whole set of things if we look back that we might have done. What we can do now is obviously still continue support for countries in the region, which are the ones which actually are taking millions of those fleeing conflict in Syria, and actually supporting governments in Lebanon and Jordan to actually support their own infrastructure to cope with that. So that's one of the things we can do. We can also do more on the peacemaking side of it. I think there's more, for example, we could be doing in negotiations with Turkey about what we do with relationship to the Kurds, which would also help the situation.
And do you think the media plays a role in creating an environment of fear with regards to immigrants and migration?
I think the media plays a very significant role in forming public attitudes on migration and asylum, and that certainly, I mean, you only have to look at the UK press and look at the regular headlines, which are about, it's always about, people coming here, what are they taking, how they're, the recognition of any sort of contribution is very small. So I think the media really stokes up a lot of fear, a lot of misinformation, and then you have cases. We had one recently with the Sun, where it had to correct a piece of information. The correction is a tiny little bit on page 3. It's not the smacking great headline that it was on page 1. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a deliberate sort of misuse and abuse of a lot of the issues around immigration and asylum by certain sections of the press.
Professor Tihanov, if I could just read you a quote which I have from one of the articles here, which is looking at what should be done about the situation. We heard from Jean Lambert MEP, and she's talking about European solutions and how we can deal with the situation. One issue is, of course, that when you have boats leaving from Libya and you have them sailing towards Italy and other European countries need to decide what they're going to do in relation to those boats. Are they going to rescue them, or are they going to turn them away? So this is what the Minister of State, Baroness Anneli of St John's, said. She was asked the question in Parliament, and the question was, are you going to increase search and rescue missions? And her response was the following: we do not support planned search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. We believe that they create an unintended pull factor, encouraging more migrants to attempt the dangerous sea crossing and thereby leading to more tragic and unnecessary deaths. So this is what she said in relation to this issue of search and rescue missions. Just to contrast that, I'll read you another quote. This is from Amnesty International. They said that Europe's negligence in failing to save thousands of migrants and refugees who run into peril in the Mediterranean has been akin to firefighters refusing to save people jumping from a towering inferno. Government's responsibility must clearly be not only to put out the fire, but to catch those who've stepped off the ledge. So the question I'd like to ask you is, should Europe be doing more to actually rescue people who are in these boats in the Mediterranean Sea? What do you think?
There is clearly a distinction to be made between legal and illegal immigration. But even that distinction does not really free Europe from the responsibility of actually saving human lives. Of course, there is this whole issue of maritime law, and I'm sure experts in maritime law would know very well that you have to know whether there's been a signal inviting help, in whose territorial waters the incident occurred, and so on and so on and so on. at the end of the day, I do think that even if you have a boat full of illegal immigrants, these people will need to be saved. And then Europe could exercise its legal discretion whether to send them back if they're illegal immigrants, or whether to exercise certain discretion and admit some of them and facilitate their settlement and integration.
Just to be provocative, Professor Theonov, and just because there are many people that would say in response, well, if you then launch more search and rescue operations, you'll get more people coming from Africa, or more people coming from these countries. So they would suggest that you're encouraging people by doing search and rescue. What do you think?
I think there are enough examples of particularly young males risking their lives to make this very, very dangerous sea journey and to arrive at Europe. In the African population now, 50% of the population of Africa is under 25. These are people who, when they weigh the risk of a journey across the Mediterranean and the certainty of a life in deprivation and instability and constant hazard, many of them would probably not hesitate twice to embark on what is clearly a journey fraught with danger. So I don't necessarily think that if you do what is necessary to save the lives of these drowning people, this would necessarily incentivize others to do the same.
Yes.
The point is, you have to save these people, and then you're free to decide whether to send them back if you consider them to be illegal immigrants, which may well be the case, or whether to admit them and launch the process of their
as
integration.
Refugees or something. What do you think, Dr. Yaz? Do you think that this rhetoric is right, that, you know, you've got to be cruel to be kind, so, you know, God forbid, let the boat sink and then it'll stop happening? What do you think?
I think the point is that migration is a natural phenomenon, and it has never stopped, and it is not going to stop. It is going to continue. Europe is going to need migrants to supplement its labor force. This is a country where aging is going to become a problem in a few years, and they need skilled people to come from outside to run their economy. So this is going to go on. But what is really important is how to handle the migrant crisis, which is there and which is causing the loss of such lives, you know, at such a large scale. So as European Union has decided, they should work with the host countries where these people are coming from and try to work out, in cooperation with the host country, a policy, a program to manage the migrants, so that, as the European Union decided last month, they should try and have a set criteria, a set way of checking who is genuine, who is not genuine, who is regular, who is irregular, and this should be done in the host country from where they are coming. That way they will also be able to have a control on the human traffickers and human smugglers, which are causing a lot of harm and problem, you know, to the international community and to those people as well, because they lure them because of their economic personal interests.
So in a way, what I hear from both Professor Theonov and Dr. Yaz is that while there are long-term solutions which need to be looked at, we cannot ignore the bodies who are floating across the seas, and many of those are dying, and to turn away from that would be a moral tragedy. Let me, if I may, sorry, Professor Theonov, I want to quickly, yeah, go ahead, please, go on.
We can, if we hide behind this whole question of resources. But ultimately, Europe's image across the world will be hugely tarnished if the EU were to choose this path of prioritizing this question of resources and prioritizing code arithmetics over the engagement with individual human lives, which do need help when help is most needed.
And I think this what I'd like to as well bring in here is we have a guest who's from Africa who can also help us to see Europe from outside of Europe, to understand how Europe is viewed by the rest of the world, not only in terms of from a migrant's perspective, wanting to come to Europe, but also an international relations angle as well. So let's now bring in Irbad Ibrahim, who's a security analyst from Ghana, who will be joining us hopefully via the telephone or via Skype now. Mr. Ibrahim, are you with us? We can give a few moments. Hopefully we'll be able to establish a connection. He'll be coming shortly. And I think in particular, when we're talking about these various issues, then I think part of your research has touched upon this, Kaleem. You had an article, I think, which you wanted to draw to our attention.
Yeah, there's quite a few articles, but the one which I found was very balanced was one by Natalie Nugurdre in The Guardian, which looks at the push factors in Africa which is causing people to leave. And what she's basically identifying is that many of the people that are coming across the Sahara and into Libya and then crossing over into Europe are coming from war-torn areas. But also, in addition to that, you also have young males who are willing to take that risk. And it's a huge risk. We have to remember that it's a day of media. And wherever you are in the world, media is very accessible. So those people who are about to embark on this journey know very well what the risks are. They know that they are putting their life on the line to get to Libya. The question that then comes is, why are they taking that risk? Why is the situation that desperate? And then leading on from that, what can be done to help alleviate that situation in those countries? Now, we must remember that historically, and Mr. Timno, this is a question perhaps for yourself, historically, Africa was colonized by Europe. Do they hence have a historical responsibility? They reaped the benefits of Africa 50, 60 years ago. Do they now have the responsibility? They mapped out Africa. They carved Africa according to the resources and their own needs. Do they now have a responsibility to cater for the citizens of Africa?
In a sense, the boomerang always returns in history, but I don't think this is a very straightforward matter, in the sense that the EU is currently suffering more from withdrawing from Africa rather than from having been present in Africa. If you compare Chinese investments in Africa right now and EU investments and Chinese economic presence and EU economic presence, it's very clear that Europe is actually not making the most of what Africa could offer in terms of growth and prospects for growth. Just before coming here, I was reading a very interesting French political commentator, Yves Gégaud. And Gégaud thinks that actually the solution, the lasting solution to this crisis, is not saving people in the Mediterranean or building screening camps in Libya. The lasting solution is for Europe actually to embrace Africa and to invest in Africa, to facilitate the total electrification of Africa, the rise in good educational practices in Africa, and then reap the benefits together with this continent that will be much more stable as a result. Africa is currently growing as an average at about 5% per year, which is a much higher growth than the European growth, admittedly from a lower basis. Bringing the two economies together in the longer term, estimates show that would probably add about 1 to 1.25% growth to Europe. But this is not a immediate solution. This is a long-term solution. And then again, it's also the difficulty of precisely this historical moment of European colonization, of actually first building sufficient foundation of trust before you embark on anything that would unfold on such scale.
Professor Tina, what's interesting in a way about what you mention is the whole concept of nationhood, of this is one country and that is another country. And I think that's worth going into, and I'd like to ask Dr. Yas, building on what Professor Dionov has said, is, Professor Dionov's almost put it out there, which is, here is the continent of Europe, here is the continent of Africa. Why is it that we should have such a tightly defined nation of concept of sovereignty? And I'd also like to bring into that the fact that many of these migrants are coming from religious contexts of whether it be civil war, Syria, Afghanistan, where religion plays a very strong role, and particularly Islam. So what is the Islamic concept of immigration, and how would an Islamic ideal response to immigration respond to the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean at the moment?
Well, actually, there are these two major issues. One is a response to humanity, because humanity is the creation of God, and all humanity is equal, they have equal rights, and they must be respected, and their fundamental basic needs be provided, their rights be provided. They should be provided with safety and security wherever they are. That is very important. But in times of crisis, the short-term policy is to deal with the crisis and help those people, save them from death or from other ailments or whatever difficulties and problems they have. But then there has to be a long-term policy as well. That is to correct the root causes which made those people suffer to that extent. And we see the same thing happening today. No international organization is trying to resolve these issues peacefully. What they are offering are guns and whatever they have, and actually yesterday the papers were saying that UK may have to send forces to fight ISIS until the finish. So there is that sort of thinking. There is no thinking that we find so far within the European Union or any country which is emphasizing the point of coming to a table and negotiating and trying to draw the attention of these countries that within their own borders they have to take care of the lives of their own people. It's a shame that people from different countries have to leave their own countries, their own homes, and seek shelter and help for their safety and security from other countries, whether it is Europe or some other region of the world. So this is a very serious crisis. Islam would definitely respond to saving the lives of these people. This is very important. They are human beings. But at the same time, we must find long-term permanent solutions. And Islam offers those solutions in its teaching, how to deal with these countries. For example, Islam says you have to try and bring these people to a table to negotiate. And if two parties do not agree, then you have to find out a way to make them agree to a peaceful solution of the problem.
I see.
So
Dr. Yas, on this point as well, I think that particularly we've mentioned about concepts of rights and also the deeper long-term solutions. I'd like to facilitate the discussion, because we've also had a video recording with Migrants' Rights Network. They've talked about some of the issues which you've raised, which both of our guests have raised. Let's have a quick look at that and then to come back into the studio. So this is Chai Patel from Migrants' Rights Network. He's given us a brief interview. Let's go to him now.
Well, the solution in Europe is for there to be safe routes in for the people fleeing the situations that are occurring in Syria and Afghanistan and Eritrea and places like that. These migrants are coming in because they're fleeing, well, they're not migrants, they're refugees, and they're coming in because they're fleeing massive situations of conflict in their home countries and don't have anywhere safe to go. people are being forced to come in through illicit routes and using people smugglers because they have no other options to get somewhere safe. And so it's very difficult to control borders and to see who's coming in and out of countries if you don't provide them with safe routes to come in. European countries have all signed up to the Refugee Convention. They've taken on an international obligation to help refugees. And if they don't provide safe routes and safe procedures by which people who want to claim asylum in Europe can come in and be processed, then we're going to see more security problems at the borders and more people coming in on boats and dying in the Mediterranean. Well, I don't think we're talking about letting in endless migrants. At the moment, there is a huge pressure because of the situation in Africa for people to get out and get anywhere safe. Now, European countries can deal with that in a number of different ways. One is by providing them with safe routes into Europe where people can be checked and where the security services can see who's coming in. And the other is to work very hard to ensure stability in safe places outside Europe as well, and to deal with the conflicts that are going on, and to provide safe places for people to stay, whether in neighbouring countries around Syria or by creating safe regions in Africa itself.
So Professor Dianov, Mr. Patel raises a very interesting point. He uses the word migrants and then he corrects himself and he says these aren't actually migrants, many of these are refugees. It's not only economic, it's also very much about war. If I could read you a quick quote and if you could let me know your thoughts on this. So this is from Amnesty International again. Just after one of the large sinkings of 700 people on a boat, then they had an interview with a man called Mohammed. So it says, Mohammed, a 25-year-old Palestinian man from Lebanon, described how on the 4th of March 2015, the boat which he was on with 150 people aboard capsized when a large tugboat approached to assist them. He gives a brief quote. He says, they threw a rope ladder. Many tried to get on it, and then the boat capsized. I fell into the water. Imiradan, a Syrian woman, died with her 1-year-old son. So it's a very brief sentence, but it's quite tragic if you really think about what's happened when in that sentence when he describes it, for a woman to die with her 1-year-old son. In light of this, and in light of what Mr. Patel has said, then is this, as the Sun journalist has said, is this an economic motivation? Are people willing to die with their 1-year-old children in the sea because they'd like to get better access to the NHS? Or is there a deeper, more tragic story to the migration crisis, which is about something else, about war and about very deep sort of persecution? What would you say?
First of all, the quote that you read is really about the fact that we should never brush aside the individual dimension of this tragic experience of being uprooted and being thrust onto a new territory without home, without people you can talk to, and sometimes locked in a transition camp for months on end. But I do take a slight issue with Mr. Patel in the sense that we shouldn't be conflating refugees and migrants, and the two streams meet in the current crisis. Some people flee what are frankly failed states. Why they're failed states is a different issue, and whether the West has responsibility for that is an important question. Others flee and they wish to come to Europe because of aspirations and because of seeking to better their lives, which is a very legitimate human motivation. But the responses to these two different groups need to be differentiated. And while I think the EU has to devise policies and to come up with solutions that put individual human lives at the very forefront of their humanitarian efforts. The EU does need to have the option to turn back economic migrants, because the resources of the EU are not unlimited, and there has to be a conversation in the West about how this is dealt with in the long term, so that European values are safeguarded, so that Europeans don't behave, I hate to say that, but in the way some other parts of the world behave when people from various nations of the Pacific Ocean seek to arrive on their shores, while at the same time...
You bring something very interesting, which is, I think, the very great, almost it summarizes the question, which is, why are people coming? And then how do you respond? And I think you've said, on the one hand, if it is purely an economic situation, the solution would be perhaps very different from if it is a genuine humanitarian crisis. But then also, as you've mentioned, that for the human experience of poverty may actually be just as tragic as the experience of war.
Yes, of course. And
I want to quickly bring in, I think, hopefully, Mr. Ibrahim, who we nearly had before. I think we have him now. And let's ask him this very question and see what his thoughts are. Mr. Ibrahim, are you with us?
Hi, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. So very good to have you with us, Mr. Ibrahim. So what we've just been talking about in the studio is, why are people coming from Africa to Europe, and what are the motivating factors? And I think particularly is, on the one hand, people would say this is purely an economic issue. People want to come to get better jobs. On the other hand, people would say, no, that's not true. Actually, it's people who are in danger of losing their lives, and they're coming to Europe because they have no other choice. What would you say?
I think the former is more a substantive reason why we see droves of Africans go aboard rickety boats to carry out that perilous voyage across the Mediterranean. I'm an African young man, and I interact quite copiously with the people in my country. I think the problem is rooted in economics. Most Africans do not understand why, in the midst of plenty, they will continue to live in penury. Africa has got all the resources.
Oh, Mr. Ibrahim,
we've got gold, we've got oil, we've got diamonds, we've got timber. But in the midst of all of this,
sorry, Sorry, Mr. Ibrahim, sorry to interrupt you. So just to test your response, in a sense, is people would then say, well, why is it that Syrian refugees have increased so greatly? And they've said that now 31% of the migrants are coming from Syria. So they would say that actually that's not economic, that's about war. What would you say?
The two-point problem. For us as Africans, when you look at the mosaic of people that have been intercepted on the high seas, many of those who come from Africa, the south of the Sahara, Eritreans, Nigerians, Ghanaians like me, Nigerians, Somalians, they aren't leaving the shores of Africa because of wars. They are leaving largely because of bad governance policies that have plagued the continent since most of the continent became independent from Western Europe in the 60s. So Syrians are fine. I work in a diplomatic mission, and I've had to process certain Middle Eastern citizens to travel to Europe. But there is a sharp contrast between the motive for Africans trying to travel to the island of Lampedusa in Italy, for example, and Syrians and Lebanese or Palestinians that are trying to evade conflicts in their various countries. Where we've had conflicts in Africa, like Liberia, Sierra Leone, Burundi, the Central African Republic, most of the migration has been inward. People travel to neighboring African countries just to seek refuge. But for people to traverse the borders of multiple countries, moving from Ghana through Burkina Faso, then you go to Agadez in Niger, find yourself in Chad or Mauritania, then you go to Libya and be in a camp so that you are processed to travel across the Mediterranean. Most of such voyages are not motivated by war, or minority persecutions, but they are motivated by the fact that people are living in poverty and they believe they can seek greener pastures when they leave the shores of the continent.
Okay.
And the other motivation is
Ibrahim,
also that...
Mr. Ibrahim, let me ask you just, I'm going to give you a quote, and if you can tell us what your thoughts are on this. So this is from Save the Children. So they tell us that children, it's about Libya, and they say children and minors are kept in these makeshift prisons where the migrants are kept for months. And the Save the Children spokesperson says that they are resorting to drinking their own urine, the children are, because they're given no food or water. They're dying of diseases. Up to 100 of them may be kept in a single room. And we're getting an increasing number of reports about children being held by smugglers for 9 months, and women are giving birth in these places with no medical assistance. Is it that the people coming from these countries don't know how bad the journey is going to be? Or is it that their poverty is so terrible that they're willing to suffer this experience? What's going on? Why would people put themselves in that position?
Especially in south of the Sahara, my dear brother, we are Muslims, and we know if the world were to give Islam the opportunity to infuse the zakat system into the world's financial system, there would be a lot of opportunities for people. Poverty smites you in the face when you come to Africa. There is so much desperation, and people will go to any length to leave the continent. So I think I agree with you that poverty is a driving force. And number two, many people are beguiled into taking up such dangerous voyages. They don't know what awaits them. Many of the girls we have in this country have had their hard-earned savings. Some of them save a little over $2,000 or $3,000 US. But because human trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar business here, there are pork people who act as intermediaries. They call themselves travel agents. That lure people into traveling to Libya with the hope of traveling to Europe. Some of them are taken to Gulf countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia with the promise of lucrative jobs. But they end up at sex slaves or child laborers at the end of the day.
I'm going to need to have to say thank you very much for your insight and your input. It's been very informative. We're going to have to come back to the studio now. Thank you very much for that, just because of time. Dr. Riaz, very strong input from Africa, because many people you might expect that actually would hear a different story, that in fact it isn't an economic input, but you know, it's one perspective, but it's certainly an important one to take into account. Having said all of that, we've talked about solutions, we've talked about search and rescue missions, we've talked about opening borders, we've talked about closing borders, we've talked about destroying smugglers' ships. What would you say are the most important solutions which we need to be looking towards to solve the migrant or the refugee crisis, as we could put it?
I think amongst the very common reasons for this migration disaster, which is conflict and which is warfare and killing, this is of course an immediate one major cause of this mass migration from the countries. But we must not deny that poverty is one of the major factors which encourages people to go through this hardship, as our brother was describing, and then hoping that they will end up somewhere where they will have peace and security, and they will be able to make a good living, which will be helpful to make a good future for their children, etc. That is a very common reason for migration amongst the third world countries in Asia and Africa and elsewhere as well. But at the moment, I think the most important consideration is how to deal with this very serious migration crisis that the world is facing. The European Union has come up with some response. They are prepared to triple their financial assistance to help assist these migrants coming into Europe. And they are trying to bring together all the members of the European Union to work together, which is not easy, because at the moment the European Union does not have the solidarity and the unity which it needs to face such a world serious crisis. But
this is where we need to be looking. Dr. Iyaz, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We've now reached 6 o'clock. I think that we could go on for at least another hour. And I think that it would be very important, really, that these views continue to be considered. I think one thing we can prompt the viewers to do is to continue this conversation via social media. I'm sure that Professor Tianov will be engaged in social media, or the institutes which you work for will be. So send your views into our Twitter account. Let Professor Tianov know via his social media links, and let's engage in that conversation, because I think that people within Europe, within Africa, need to understand the causes, but also really think very seriously about what future generations will do, because these problems are most likely to increase, I would say, from what we've heard from our special guests in the studio today. So Kaleem, I think on behalf of both of us, we must say thank you very much, of course, to Professor Tianov and to Dr. Iyaz for joining us today. Thank you very much. And may the peace and blessings of God be upon our viewers at home, and we hope to see you next month on the next episode of Press Point. Thank you very much.
Has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.